Hello, Bill.
Hello, Richard. How are you today?
How are you?
I'm
Fine.
doing well. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you.
Hi, Richard. Hi, Bill.
Hello, Geoff.
Hi,
Hey, Geoff.
nice to meet you. Hey, Bill. Long time no see.
Yeah, great to see you again.
Likewise. Is that a real forest? No, it's a backdrop, right?
No, that's the real thing. This is my house plants with my backyard behind.
Oh wow, it's amazing.
I'm renting this place for about a year or so, and this is one of the joys of it.
Fantastic.
Hi, Bill. Hi, Geoff. I think, Richard, we can start if you'd like, so we can keep the time.
Okay. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for attending this afternoon session. We are going to talk about accounting for planetary boundaries and social foundation. But before to start, I just would like to remind you about some rules. So we're going to have between the conference speakers to manage our video and microphone. But for the participant, I will ask you please to mute your microphone and to turn your camera off. And please feel free to send your question using the chat. So we're going to spend 1 hour together. There will be a half an hour presentation. And after that, we will have 20 minutes of discussion of talks with the panelists. And we'll finish with 10 minutes of question and answer with you. So my name is Richard Jabot. I am a researcher at the research center in Audencia, and I'm really pleased and honored to share this hour with you with Bill Baue, Senior Director for Air 3.0, and also with Geoff Kendall from Futurefit Foundation. He's the CEO and the co-founder, and I think so we're gonna have a lot of time to discuss with them later on. Well, I will start by just, I don't know if you know this very smiling lady, so I can imagine that she's quite familiar for some of you. Well, actually, this is late Donella Meadows, so she's very well known for being the lead author of The Limit to Growth in 1972, but she's also known to write a report for the Balaton Group in 1998 about indicators and sustainability. And she informed us that we really, if we want to talk about sustainability indicator, we do have to add the notion of time, limit, and target. And we will see that those points will be quite important for us during this presentation. So how we will address that, we will first talk about the safe space from the origin up to the critics. We will then discuss the safe and just space. So we'll talk about social foundation, the donut, and we will ask ourselves if it's a real space or just a vanishing ring. We will see the allocation, which is a key issue, and we'll see why it's a key issue and what we can do and at the country levels. And we will finish by talking about how we can manage those ideas at the corporation level. So when we talk about the safe space for humanity, we talk about the planetary boundaries, and the idea behind that is to try to stay in what the researcher called the Holocene state. So everything I will say started with two papers, one from Rockstrom and Al in 2009 and an updated version by Stefan and Al in 2015. And those academics considered that because of human activity, we have affected, we have damaged some systems that were maintaining the Earth in a very stable condition. On the left side, you have here this stable period, which is called the Holocene, which started between 10 and 12,000 years ago. And you see that the temperature was very stable. And they also inform us saying that without any human activity, this stable state was supposed to last for the coming thousands of years. And it's very important. This stability is very important for the human development. It's between this period that we've seen the rise of agriculture in the different part, or the rise of large cities and large civilization. So the idea that those academics have was to try to define the frame and to find the fundamental condition which were necessary to have this the system Earth inside this Holocene-like state. And what they discover actually is that there is 9 biophysical processes which are involved and which are so far under human pressure. And they also warn us that just by violating or crossing one of the boundaries that they find, this can lead us towards abrupt and irreversible changes. And so far, and it's the point from the last paper in 2015, it seems that we have crossed 4 of those boundaries: the climate change one, the biosphere integrity, the flows of phosphor and nitrogen, and the last system change. So we are already above those limits, those four limits. Here, maybe it's time to clarify some of some terms between boundaries, thresholds, or limit. Actually, some of the processes have a threshold, a kind of tipping point that you can calculate. But even when it's like that, it's always calculated within a zone of uncertainty, and some do not have this kind of tipping point. So what Rockstrom and Hall did, they talk about planetary boundary, which is actually a specific point that you put at a safe distance from the threshold or at the lower level of the zone of uncertainty. It's based on the precautionary principle. So here, and it's important to keep this in mind, you have a normative decision. Of course, it's based on science, but the decision to put the boundary at this point or this one, it's really a normative decision, and it's really based on how our society, how do we perceive the risk. And it's also a matter of solidarity, because you can imagine that putting the planetary boundary at a certain level or at another, I mean, the impact behind that could be different from one region to another. So this framework started to raise some critics. For example, Stefan and Hall do consider that, well, it's quite silent regarding how to use resources, or what about the level of wealth or the size of the population. How we have just seen Drowning and Hall say that, well, it's quite difficult sometimes, even as Nicola previously in the afternoon said, there is some boundaries without threshold or without control variables. So in 2020, Boutin and Gontran say, okay, but it seems like we are trying to play with a kind of anthropocenic scorecard where we try to manipulate or to play or to manage the system. Or said they said it's questionable to act like that. Another critics, which started from the beginning in 2009 by Schlesinger, was to say that, well, as soon as you put a boundary somewhere, there is the risk that you don't move until you cross this boundary, and it might be too late. As we have seen also, it's the decision to put the boundary at a level or another. It's done by experts, and we can say by Western and white experts, so far from or only from developed country, and without that much public consultation. So this is a critique. It's also the same critiques that we can find by Bierman and Kim regarding the fact that there is no consideration about any regional or historical distribution of the causes of this crossing of boundaries. And for Van Veen and Hall, there is one point, is that we are lacking the social dimension. We don't know actually to link between the human driver and those biophysical dimension. So this last point leads us to the second step for where we consider the safe and just space for humanity this time, where we're going to try to link those two, I would say, dimensions. And here we are back to 1974. It's a UN meeting in Mexico, in the town of Cocoyoc, where some scientists and economists met, and for the very first time they starting to speak in the same paper about the inner limits. So they talk about the fundamental, the basic human needs compared to the outer limits, so the biophysical limits or integrity of the planet. And they already warn us or ask us or recommend us to try to move in a system where we can achieve the inner limits for all human beings in the world, but trying to do that without violating or crossing any of the outer limits of the planet. So this idea was taken back a few years later by Kate Howarth, an economist working at that time for Oxfam, and she tried to dig out a little bit. I mean, the idea of the inner limits, so based on some different philosophical and political sources. She came with 12 social foundations, which are now linked with the SDG, with the Sustainable Development Goals. And a few years ago, in 2017, she came with a list of indicators, 1 or 2 indicators for each of the 12 dimensions. With you have the percentage of what is achieved at the world level. So the idea for Howarth was to say that it seems that when you combine the inner and the outer limit, you can define a kind of a sweet spot where we have to say. And she make it clear that for her, this is the complete donut. So it's the way she defined it. It's the challenge for this century. It's our challenge for this century. And the idea is to bring humanity and to keep humanity inside this safe and just space for humanity. And she make it clear by saying that, well, this idea of the donut, this concept could be used as the compass for any human progress in the coming years, I would say. But as soon as she started to think about that, some scholars say, okay, we are talking about a space, but is it really a space? And so some academics talk about, or aren't we talking about a vanishing ring? It's a work from O'Neill and Al in 2018, and you can go to on the website of the Leeds University. You can play on this website, and you can play with France, for example. And here you see that France is achieving almost all the social foundation, but this is done at the cost of crossing 5 out of 7 of the boundaries. In the meantime, in Bangladesh, they don't cross any ecological ceiling, but they are just achieving one of the social foundation. And if you play this game for all the countries in the world, and this was done by O'Neill and his colleague, this is what you get. So we should be here. All the countries should be here, so where we don't transgress the biophysical boundaries, but we achieve all of the social threshold, but you see that it's an empty space so far, maybe except Vietnam. And you also can imagine that the trajectory that has to be followed for this group of countries where we can find France, USA, and a Western country, I will say, would be quite probably different from the trajectory from those countries where you find Bangladesh when we're gonna have to move over there. And the point when we see this different trajectory will be to know how to allocate this safe and just space. The point is that from the very beginning, Stefan and Al and Brockstrom also make it really clear that the planetary boundaries was a global concept. It was not supposed to be designed or to be downscaled. But in the same paper in 2015, they also make it clear that there is a need to apply, if we want to apply this PB thinking, so planetary boundary thinking, there is a need to apply it at lower levels. The reason is that because decisions are usually taken by governments, corporations, or actors at this lower level. So this is really mandatory if to go at those levels if we really want to have this kind of useful framework. So the question is how can we translate the planetary boundaries? So there was some proposal, for example, from Aya and Al in 2016, and it's a 3 steps, I would say, translation process to move from the planetary boundaries to the national targets. The first dimension is to consider the biophysical one. So it's to separate maybe between the boundaries at a global level, like climate change or ozone, and the one which are more at a local level, like fresh water. And it's when you aggregate the impact at a lower level that you have an impact. We might have an impact at the global level. Second dimension is the socio-economic one. So here we do have to consider between production perspective and what we call consumption-based perspective. The second one, the consumption-based perspective, is just the point that when you talk about your country, you will include the impact and the pressure coming from the imports that you use in your domestic consumption. So this approach is much more close to the reality of your country impact. And the last one is the ethical dimension. So it's second level of normativity. The point is, when we talk about the ethical reason to allocate something, is that, I mean, the right and the responsibility of countries or individuals is different. So here we do not have a scientific problem. It's really a political one, meaning that so far there is no globally accepted methodology to calculate the fair share of a country, of a person, or of an industry or a sector. So probably without being exhaustive, I mean, you can find in the literature some equity principles that can help to back the way we can allocate the boundaries. So here you have a few principles that can be equality. So that means that each human being has the same right, or it could be responsibility. It's based on the fact that if you pollute, you're going to have to pay, and so on. And those principles are leading to some, or backing some allocation rules. And one more time here, this is not an exhaustive list. You can find some more. And but you see, and I will not definitely go through all of them, just to show you that there is a lot of possibility to do this allocation rules, and just maybe to keep in mind that so far it's the per capita one. So when you allocate the same quantity for one person, it's the oldest, easiest, and of course mostly used rules so far. So just keep in mind this, and the fact, and we will see this later on, that according to the rules that you're going to select, the results, the slide of the pie that you're going to get, or the part of the budget that you're going to get, will be different. So what we do and the way we work on that is, when you define the carrying capacity that you don't want to cross, so the planetary boundary, or you define the safe operating space, as we just have seen, you choose and you apply one of several allocation rules. So it will give you the part of the budget. You also have, in the meantime, to calculate the impact of your entity that you survey using the same unit, and then you can compare. Then you can calculate the ratio between the impact with the allocated PB or operating space, hoping that your impact will be lower than the allocated boundaries. So what we find at the country level, so there is some, one of the first paper was from Nyquist in Sweden. We also, from Oxfam in 2014, they calculated, or they designed a donut for Scotland and for UK. So here on the right side, you have the Scottish one at that time. So you see that they were crossing some of the boundaries, and they were not achieving the social foundation. Another example, that the same year from Cole and Al, there was about South Africa. And here what's interesting is that they kept the same meaning, the same design, but they adapted a little bit the boundaries and the social foundation to be specific to South Africa. You can also find the result in this way. That was from a paper from DOUGHNUT A on Switzerland. Also here you see that regarding the climate change, the Swiss footprint was almost 23 times higher than the expected budget for Switzerland. Well, in France, it's quite recent, but I mean, the idea of the concept is entering the discussion. You find the link to the planetary limit in the environmental statement of France for 2019. In the very same year, there was an adoption in the Parliament of an amendment regarding a law about waste and a circular economy. They were saying that the objective is to achieve a neutral ecological footprint while respecting the framework of the planetary limit. So the concept is inside the French law so far. A year after, there was a proposal, a bill was proposed by some member of the parliament to recognize ecocide crime and planetary boundaries, and they went even up to ask for the creation of a high planetary boundaries authority. But the vote was negative. But you see, the idea is arriving step by step. So what about cooperation now? So first point to keep in mind is that, well, cooperation, individuals, countries, everybody has to do his part, and it's make it clear that organizations have to recognize and consider the planetary boundaries. For example, in 2013, there was a paper from Whiteman and al. Where they tried to show that a company on an industry can have several impact on the boundaries at different scales. It could be local, regional, or planetary scale. And they also, by using the example of Unilever in Indonesia, they link the work of Unilever with the Saming Group, which is a forest company cutting trees for Unilever. And they show that both companies are having direct effect on some boundaries and I would say second sight or retroaction effect. So the key point from their paper was to say that it's very important to talk or to think about the coupling whenever you are the coupling between the boundaries, and also to think about the coupling between the organizations themselves. Some other example that we can use is the sectoral approach. This time it's a paper from Jabot and al. 2019 regarding the power sector in the USA. And this time they used, it's a mix, it's a multiplication of two allocation rules. The first one, it's a per capita classical one, where they take the population of the US compared to the world population. So they times this to the planetary boundary. And the second one, they consider the gross value added of the US power sector compared to the world US economy. And when you times that, you can compare with the planetary boundary and based on the life cycle impact assessment. And you can compare if you are above or below that. Another little bit more complicated approach by Wolf and al. For food sector. This time they use three rules. Three rules. The first one was to take the grandfathering principle and to adapt it to each different sector according to the boundaries they studies. Inside the sector, for each company, it's based on the market share. And so they do consider the number of customers that you have. And the last one is, one more time, the per capita one, where they divide the planetary boundary. There is the same rate for each person. So when you times this, you really do have, I would say, the company level budget for this boundary. Some maybe key message to keep in mind regarding the allocation principle and rules, is, as we have seen already, the choice will have important impact on the result of your allocation. Here, just to keep in mind, it's the paper from Agelstad et al. In 2020. So if you just consider the first column, here you have three allocation principles. So you have the per capita, you have the grandfathering one, and you have the ability to pay. And here you see that it's a logarithmic scale. You have a ratio of 10 between equal per capita and grandfathering. It's even almost 100 between ability to pay and grandfathering. So that means that according to the rules you get, I mean, the part of the pie is completely different. So they suggest that we have to keep a certain level of flexibility and maybe to use and to test more allocation principle. And also, instead of trying to find or to look for a general agreement for an allocation rules, maybe at least try to be clear and transparent on the choice of the rules that you decide to use. So we will finish with some of the uses of the concept at the corporation level. The first one is the science-based target initiative, so which considered that a company can definitely play a role in trying to fight or to limit the climate change and to limit the temperature rise at below 1.5 or 2 degrees. And they base their work on the GHG protocol. They're asking for companies to take the most ambitious target, and they suggest, they propose, as we have already seen later in the afternoon, they propose three methodology that can be used. The first one is the absolute one, which is the easiest and simplest one, or it's the matter of the construction of the absolute emission. The second one is regarding the sectorial approach. And this time we are talking about the convergence of the emission intensity for each sector. And so far it's only applying to 6 different sectors, as you can see. It's a matter of calculating the intensity target in tons of CO2 per ton of production. And so far, if you choose this approach, it's only the 2 degrees scenario which is available. And the last one is the economic one, where you calculate this time regarding intensity reduction in terms of CO2 divided by value added. And so far, it's a less robust solution so far. But probably during the discussion, we can come back on that. They also do have a specific approach for SMEs. So they consider SMEs I mean, being a corporation with less than 500 persons. And for SMEs, they clearly recommend to use the absolute target. And so the company just has to select either the 1.5 option or the second option. When you do that, you only have to calculate and make your inventory on the scope 1 and 2. Scope 3 is free, I will say. So you can, if you want, you can measure and you can reduce, but it's not mandatory to be part of the initiative. And then you just have to publicly report your statement, fill the paper, and pay the fee that you're going to have to pay. Another approach is the Futurefit. So I will be brief because we will come back on that. But the idea behind the Futurefit is that, well, it seems that it's possible to have a global economy that meets our needs, humanity needs, and that enable us to stay in the planetary limits. But for that, we're going to have to look for a future fit society with 8 characteristics regarding energy, regarding water, or regarding waste. And this means that each business can play its part and to achieve, and it seems possible, so to achieve this flourishing humanity inside the carrying capacity of the planet. And to help each company to do that, the Futurefit proposed 23 break-even goals for each business. So that means the objective to limit and eliminate the negative impact of the activity. But on top of that, they propose 24 positive pursuits. That means that it's a 24 approach to help other business either to amplify their positive impact or to reduce or lower their negative ones. We'll come back with Geoff about that. And last point is the Global Threshold and Allocation Council, which is incubated by EAR 3.0. And we will come back on that also with Bill. Well, the statement is quite clear. As we have seen, there is no global governance to edit or to validate thresholds and allocation. So the objective of the council is to identify those thresholds and norms, or to design, validate, or even generate allocation methodology, and after to disseminate. And this is based on the fact that there is a responsibility to go and move and stay inside the safe and just space. So as a conclusion, what can we say? First, there is still some pending discussion. So, for example, from Bevington and al., there is some question regarding the appropriate level. So maybe that from some boundaries, cooperation level is not appropriate. It's also interesting to think about at a sectoral level, as we have seen. There is also the question of adding some institutional pressure and not only to wait on auto-regulation or voluntary approach, which might be limited. We also have seen that there is a lack of democratic legitimacy for the concept. So it has to be constructing, and if we want to universalize this approach. And we are back here with Donella Meadows. You remember time was one of probably the most important point to add. And maybe except with climate change, it's something which is lacking. So for example, we don't know when we cross a border, how long it will take to step back from the border. Or we should calculate probably the ratio between the time our action will produce effect compared to the time the situation is worsening. There is, of course, the question of the allocation, the choice of the allocation rules, and why not? Why not? Or why do we have to take the same rules for all the boundaries? So maybe it's question of mixing, which could be interesting to test. There is also a question regarding business models, so meaning that it's not enough just to consider how we are producing things, but what we are producing and the impact on our generation and the coming ones. And last but not least, it's the question of the certification, where it could be interesting to apply some certification scheme to have incentive for producer and support for customer. So just to finish, DOUGHNUT framework, it's very interesting tool and a framework, because it's really show us that we are inside some biophysical limits. It's also important because it's linking the socio-economic activities and the biophysical limits. So in the term of Lucien Sèvres, the French philosopher, I mean, it's linking the anthropologic crisis and the ecologic ones. And if we also consider with Kate Rowers that it's an appropriate compass, the point is that it doesn't tell us how to go there, how to do it. So we have a plenty of donuts. So it can go from WBCSD, who is saying to go there, we need to have more capitalism, even if it's a different one, or some scholars like Fioramonti who say that if we want to come back to Holocene, we have to stop and forget about looking for growth at any cost. So DOUGHNUT also create this space for the debate between reformist perspective or revolutionary perspective. but what is important to keep in mind is that, okay, it's definitely, yes, we want to survive, but it's not the last question. Andre Gore say, I mean, it's not only a matter of cleaning our mess and making the earth livable again, but what type of humanity do we want? Thank you for your attention. I'm a bit long, I'm sorry. And I think it's time to have some question to speakers. So I will leave the place. Maybe it's is it okay? So, well, as I said, as you have seen, I was quite fast, I will say, when I was talking about Air 3.0 and Futurefit. So maybe I will start by asking you, and maybe I will start with you, Bill, to come back on the Air 3.0 and maybe to explain maybe much more clearly the link between Air 3.0 and the GTAC.
Sure. Thanks, Richard. Excellent presentation. Great to follow up on that. So yes, the R3.0, which stands for Redesign for Resilience and Regeneration, we've been incubating for a number of years the notion of a global thresholds and allocations council. And we've actually recently been pivoting and are in the process of shifting to add the notion of a global thresholds and allocations network, since there are so many players that are operating in this arena, including Geoff and Futurefit and Kate and the Donut Economics Action Lab, et cetera. So the idea of networking these organizations so that they can identify commonalities and common cause, if you will, is what we're currently working on. But the core idea of the Global Thresholds and Allocations Council really dates back to the literature that you cited, the Donella Meadows and the Limits to Growth report, Barbara Ward and the Kokoyuk Declaration. But importantly, the Global Reporting Initiative's Sustainability Context Principle in 2002 that established the need to make this micro-macro link between the micro-level organizational impacts and the macro-level systemic sustainability. And so that's where we need to attend to these systems-level thresholds. So that's what Rockstrom and the Stockholm Resilience Center talk about with the planetary boundaries, and Kate Rayworth added the social foundations. Those apply at a systems level, and so it's really the allocations, or how do you apply that to an organizational level. And as you know, there are many different allocation methodologies, and I think I can go into that in more depth in a subsequent round. But point being that we at R3.0 are trying to spur the emergence of a governance mechanism or governance mechanisms, if you will, to attend to these thresholds and allocations, which right now there really is no governance. I think it was really important to note that French development that didn't get passed, but we can see that the writing is the wall that we need to head in that direction. So I'll leave it at that for now. Okay,
thank you, Bill. We will come back on the allocation rules. Geoff, I will ask you the same question. I was also very, very fast on the Futurefit Foundation. So do you want to add something and maybe try to highlight the concept of the break-even goals compared to the positive pursuits?
Yeah, okay, Richard, thanks very much. So what we're trying to do at Futurefit is translate all this wealth of great academic research, in particular the work of Donella Meadows, which Richard and Bill referred to, understanding the Earth as a system and how to uphold our social foundations while living within the carrying capacity of the planet, and trying to translate that academic research into actionable guidance for companies. And typically, principles can be very helpful, but what companies really get and understand is if you've got clear goals to aim for and ways to guide and measure progress toward those goals. So we've tried to translate the system science into a set of what we call break-even goals, which represent the extra financial break-even point for business. So we know what the financial break-even point is. You make as much money as you spend, or you're not around for very long. So if we think about the sustainable future, what is the extra financial break-even point? The line in the sand that every organization needs to reach across all major environmental and social issues to be sure it's not in any way undermining our progress toward the future we need. So that's the break-even goals. And then the positive pursuits is all of those outcomes that you could deliver that credibly move us closer to an environmentally restorative, socially just, and economically inclusive future. So you could imagine, for example, even before you've eliminated your own greenhouse gas emissions within your company, you could be delivering products and services that really help meet the basic needs of underserved people. So you can't really cancel these out and trade these off. But what you can do is provide a way to articulate all of that positive stuff you're doing in the context of all the negative stuff that you're striving to eliminate. And that's what Futurefit tries to do, and be a kind of sat nav to success for a 21st century business.
Okay, I will continue with you, Geoff. You've seen that in the afternoon we talk about the SMEs, and I just would like maybe to know if those break-even goals and positive pursuit are usable by SMEs, or do we have to adapt, or is it like the SBT initiative that you have something specific for SMEs?
It's an interesting question, and the answer has surprised us, actually. I mean, all the best strategy is post-rationalized, of course, but I think when we started out, we thought that, you know, providing 600-700 pages of really detailed guidance to companies, it was only a large company that was going to really pay attention to that. But what we found actually is that SMEs have been really quick to embrace Futurefit, because a lot of them nowadays are starting up with a view to being purposeful from day one. Right. So if they've got a framework which gives them everything they need to understand their impacts in a holistic way and to help them make better decisions to get on the right trajectory, they're really keen on that. Now, often the challenge is more with the incumbent businesses that have been doing everything they can to get more efficient at doing things which are intrinsically problematic over the last few decades, and getting them to stop and change direction becomes incredibly hard. So you can think of it as SMEs are like a speedboat that, you know, you give them the right compass and they will go for it, versus the incumbents are often more like a kind of large tanker that
heavy tanker.
Yeah.
Okay, Bill, we were talking about and I've shown a list of some allocation rules, which is definitely not exhaustive. So I just would like maybe to have your feedback on that. So are you with the council? Are you working on the type of allocation, or can you clarify maybe the history of the different allocation rules, the one that are mainly used on top of the per capita, for example?
Sure. So the first thing I would say is that allocations are happening all the time. So we as humanity are always allocating resources. And so I fully agree with the point that you made earlier, which is essentially we at the very least need transparency on how we are making those decisions, if not guidance or governance on doing so in the way that's both scientifically valid and socially just. And so along those lines, you know, what we've seen, as Geoff said, that there's experimentation and prototyping and piloting in the real world that's been happening arguably since 2006. So I wrote a chapter for a UNEP paper in 2015 where I tried to track all of the activity up until that point. And so the first instance of a thresholds and allocations based approach that I could find was at Ben & Jerry's, the Unilever subsidiary, in 2006, that the Center for Sustainable Organizations, Mark McElroy, led for them. And that took a per capita allocation approach. The next that really emerged was from British Telecom, which took an economic allocation. So that's, you know, what's the value add of this company compared to GDP. And those were the two primary approaches that had developed. And in fact, the CSO methodology shifted over to an economic allocation. And this was all around climate change. Much of the early allocation efforts were around climate change. More recently, other allocation methodologies have come into play. As you mentioned, the Science Based Targets Initiative has introduced a physical allocation or a sectoral allocation. So what's the physical output in a sector? And that's their sectoral decarbonization approach. I won't go into the details, but I am currently in a bit of a dialogue, I guess you might call it, with the Science Based Targets as an original instigator of that initiative around their governance of setting recommendations on these. The short version would be, I don't see any reason for putting blockages to what is arguably the most robust methodology out there right now. But I'll leave it to folks to check out the links in the sidebar and not take up time with that. The last thing I'll say, though, is that there are some areas that there's no allocation necessary. So for human rights respect, that's not something that's allocated, or a living wage. That's something that the responsibility belongs fully with the organization. It's not a shared resource that it has to slice up. So that's a first pass answer at your question, Richard.
Yes, thank you. Geoff, how can you tell us how can Futurefit can guide any positive impact?
So on the positive impact side, what we've done is we've started with the system science, the kind of boundary conditions within which society needs to operate to ensure the possibility that humans' life can flourish on Earth forever. And that work's been around for 30 plus years. But we've said, okay, so those boundary conditions tell us the kind of guardrails of what we shouldn't do, right? So we shouldn't contribute to a systematic build-up of human-made substances in the environment, for example. Okay, but there are plenty of things that you can do to actually pull back from those boundaries. So this describes the outcomes you can deliver that do that. So, for example, an organization using the Futurefit approach, absolutely it's incumbent on the organization to eliminate all of its own waste and all of its own contribution to post-consumer waste. But where it goes into, and that's just break even, that's just being a responsible 21st century business. But when it comes to positive impact, well, maybe you can reclaim waste from the environment, so reversing that impact, and actually use that within your products and services, for example, right? Maybe you can meet the basic needs of people who were previously underserved. Maybe you can bring economic opportunity to those people by giving them access to markets. So we've started with the system science and gone through an iterative process over a period of several years with multiple rounds of expert feedback to come up with this categorization of these outcomes, what we call the positive pursuits, and there's 24 of them. And the guidance around what they are and how to assess progress against them, we draw heavily on the work of the Impact Management Project, which some of the attendees have probably come across as well.
I have one. I finished by saying that in the topics that are the issues that are still raised, there is the point of the certification. So how, maybe Bill, you want, we had some discussion a little bit about that. So how you think that we can address this dimension?
Yeah, I think that the certification and validation or verification question is important one, and that's actually an issue that is sort of currently on the table right now with the Science Based Targets Initiative, in the sense that they're a methodology creator, a de facto standard setter, and the validator, which in the standards world is really problematic. So I think that and it's understandable that early in the development of a field, you would have this kind of, not necessarily best practices. But I think that we need to swiftly move to best practices. That's, part of our reason behind creating Global Thresholds and Allocations Council, is to provide that kind of guidance around the governance necessary for certification and validation. So in that particular instance, I believe that, for example, science-based targets really needs to move to third-party validation of their target, companies matching their targets as soon as possible. So that's sort of, I know we're pressed for time, so I'll keep it at that.
Oh, it's okay. We have time. It's okay. Geoff, what's your position regarding this topic of certification and verification?
This is a very complex space. I think that what we need to get to is a point where we have widely agreed standard approaches that can be independently assured by any registered auditor. And that's the approach that we've tried to take with Futurefit. We work really closely with Grant Thornton, one of the world's biggest assurance companies, to make sure that our guidance was sufficiently precise that you could expect two companies to implement it in the same way, and then any auditor could come in and provide assurance for what they've done. And I think the challenge we've got today, to Bill's point, even something as mature as science-based targets, because let's not fool ourselves, the only one where we're close to any kind of decent allocation mechanism is carbon, right? Everything else we're nowhere near. Right? Certainly not nowhere near having a globally recognized standard. But even with carbon, Bill's pointed out some of the problems there, not just around governance, but around which of these approaches are even kind of being endorsed or not. And I think that what concerns me is we're kind of heading over the cliff here, and we're in danger of arguing over how much each one of us should contribute a little bit to pushing the brake pedal, right? Are we all going to slam the brakes on, get to net zero, come up with completely different business models that are actually carbon negative? Or are we going to worry about exactly who's doing what? This kind of zero-sum game mentality that has been baked into our economic thinking for, a couple of hundred years now. And I think the challenge we've got, Bill's right, we allocate all the time, and we need a good way to allocate and a conscious way to allocate. But the challenge with saying, well, how much am I allowed to use of this big pie, right? Yep. Well, meanwhile, loads of, for every organization that's consciously doing that, you've got 99 organizations who don't give a shit, right? Yeah. That's where you get into real problems. So the assurance, the certification of validation, really important, but there are some more fundamental things to sort before that, I think.
But we have seen that, the equity principle and the allocation rules, there is a bunch of possibility, and each organization or sector or country might or will choose the one with the less effort. Right. So how can we handle that? We have to? Do you think it will be possible to have one allocation rule one day, or it's a huge discussion, I can imagine?
Yeah, it is, and I think the road to civilizational collapse is paved with good principles. You've only got to look at everything from the PRI to, well, any number of things I could mention, right? And it's very easy to sign up to principles and then to interpret those as you see fit, and that's the challenge. And we've tried to avoid that by translating the principles into a concrete set of goals, that on the basis that if everybody were to do this, we would be okay, right? And then try to provide the market mechanisms, like engage. We spend as much of our time talking to the likes of pension funds and sovereign wealth funds as we do talking to companies, on the basis that, if they start putting pressure on companies, well, then they're going to damn well pay attention to this, right? So rather than kind of say which carbon allocation scheme is better than which other one, our approach is to say, no, get to net zero as quick as you humanly can, proper net zero, not with offsets, and explain the trajectory you're on, what you're doing to get to net zero, how quickly you're going to get there, and why you're not getting there any quicker, right? And that's the kind of thing I think we need to get towards. And then the idiosyncrasies of whether someone is trying to game a particular principle or not vanish. because you've got that transparency on what they're trying to do and whether they've got a credible story to get there. And I'm sorry to say that most people with a science-based target today, who've even got an official one, is very hazy as to how they're going to hit it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree.
Bill,
with
maybe it's I'm sorry, it's the last intervention. After we will ask Delphine to raise some question.
Great. Can I just say real quickly?
Yes, please go ahead. Yep.
So I agree with Geoff here that essentially, you know, we've been using sort of the entry level bar as our, you know, our highest bar for the last 2 decades. Essentially, we've been perceiving these thresholds as that's our goal. And as the Futurefit framing makes clear, no, that's the baseline. You know, that's your starting point. So we're not even at our starting point for operating in a way that could continue on like in the Holocene. So you know, the companies that I'm in conversation with. So for example, we're working with the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development right now, and we've developed a set of indicators that are similar in some ways to Futurefit, in the sense that they talk about both context-based thresholds and necessary transformation. That's the second and third tier in that typology. And the companies who are piloting those are saying to us, we recognize that if we just shoot for our fair share, that, you know, the laggards are going to pull our positive performance down. So we in many ways have to go beyond what is our fair share. So I do agree that your fair share is just the absolute limit. It's not actually going to get us out of the mess, knowing that there are laggards and poachers, as somebody said in the sidebar there.
Thank you, Delphine. If you want to raise some question.
Yeah, there was a question from Graham. I don't know if Bill, you'd like to answer about responsibility and how multi-capital thinking could be approached, and still a very US maybe based question on the role of SASB and how SASB and IRC merger could lead to something different. If you can take that both on, and then Geoff can also.
Sure, I'll be quick. So SASB and IARC certainly welcome that merger, but neither of them actually integrates thresholds into their work. So, you know, until they do, and they've been encouraged to do so in no uncertain terms since their foundings in 2012. So, you know, I welcome SASB and IARC moving into this 21st century approach. In terms of the political tensions, and there's a way for multi-capitalist thinking to function with red state politicians. I mean, I guess one thing that I will say is I could just point to a comment that was made by one of the SEC commissioners last week about the push to get ESG into SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission regulation. And the problem here is actually we would need to get it into legislation before we can get it into regulation. So in the US, there's no requirement to operate sustainably. The only thing that's in the legislation and the case law is to operate sustainably financially. So that's a major problem. And I think that what it requires is maybe depoliticizing this in the sense that it's a question of survival, both on the financial sides and on the ecological and social sides. But I'm not an expert on diplomatically dealing with folks who I believe are misguided in their thinking. I try as best I can, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, could I chip in on the whole SASB IRC thing? So I would like to hope that this is going to result in some kind of embracing of thresholds that could help to standardize this. I don't think it will. And I think that's primarily because SASB's focus has always been on what investors care about, right? So this is about financial materiality. You've only got to look at the pharmaceutical industry SASB standard to see that, because it doesn't include any environmental indicators. It's only social ones. Despite the use of, you know, lots of water in that industry, despite the fact that they are crazy contributor to single-use plastics, all this kind of thing. So that's one thing. And also, I suspect that bolting that kind of threshold-based approach onto two things that are already there and trying to merge those two things is not really the way we're going to get like adoption of thresholds in any kind of standardized, coherent way. I think we need to just simplify this. And the number of people in companies that I heard from after the SASB IRC merger was announced that just rolled their eyes. And one person said to me, actually, oh, great, so we've stopped rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Now we're breaking two deck chairs apart to build a bigger one. And I mean, I think that's a very cynical view, but I can understand how people in companies have got to that point when it's a kind of alphabet soup of acronyms that none of which is really helping us move to where we need to be.
I think we've gone through the questions, and the time is also up. Again, it goes really fast. I realized how fast all the conference has actually gone. Richard, maybe you can close the conference and then present the last one.
Okay, thank you, Geoff, and thank you, Bill, for sharing this 1 hour on the planetary boundaries and the social foundation. Sorry. Next session will start at 5 p.m. and it will be about the result of the study between IFAC and Audencia about internal auditors ESG practices. So there is a 15 minutes break first. And keep in mind that if you want to stay in touch with us, you have a few possibilities to get some news. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Great presentation.
Thank you, Geoff. Thank you, Bill.
Great. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Geoff. Take care.